record. Perfect, thank you. So welcome everybody to our January Science Education Department seminar series. This is the first series for the spring semester. Our topic today is high school science and engineering fairs, science for everyone. Looking at how best to accomplish science education, which is increasingly focused on including hands-on science and engineering practices. And science and engineering fairs provide an ideal means for students to experience this for themselves, including the science and engineering practices that you will find in the next generation science standards. It's our pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Fred Grinnell, who is the Robert McLemore Professor of Medical Science in the Department of Cell Biology at University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. He founded and was the first director of the UT Southwestern Ethics in Science and Medicine program, and he also continues to organize the North Texas Bioethics Network. For a lot of his career, his research focused on cell biology of tissue organization and wound repair, and more recent research is focusing on science education, especially student experiences in high school science and engineering fairs. Fred has written 2 books about the nature of scientific inquiry, The Scientific Attitude, and Everyday Practice of Science, where intuition and passion meet objectivity and logic. He is also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the section on history and philosophy of science. So welcome, Fred, and we will turn the presentation over to you. Also, if people want to ask questions, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand, and depending on how backed up we get, we'll take them as we go, and then we may have to hold some till the end. So thank you, Fred, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to have a chance to visit with you all and share our research and get your sort of feedback and ideas about what we've been doing. I think my screen is shared, so if the PowerPoint is here and opens up, everybody can see that okay? Good. So this is a diagram from an article by Cook et al. That was published a couple of years ago, describing all of the variables in science fair. I really like this diagram. It captures in a really nice way all of the things going on, the design elements, teacher factors, school factors, student factors, and outcome. And what we've been doing in our research is focusing right here on science fair experience. So we've been asking students about their experiences in relationship to all of these other kinds of things. So today in my talk, I want to cover 4 things. First, how I got interested in the project. Second, our research model. Third, our key findings. And finally, if there's time, future research aims. So as Cynthia mentioned, I have a longstanding interest in ethical issues in science, and I was writing this paper about 10 years ago on research integrity and everyday practice. And in the course of writing this paper and looking at this article appears, this news piece appears in Science magazine, Young but How Innocent. And it's about a science fair project where the students' project was to find out how honest the other members of the science fair were. And they ended up concluding not very honest. And their project actually got them to the International Science and Engineering Fair. Science Unfair, a reformative analysis of parental factors and research misconduct. So that sort of, since I was writing this paper, I decided, hey, I ought to see if there's any literature out there that's published. And I came across this paper from a Montreal group about how prevalent cheating was. And it's cited in the literature, but it's remarkably sparse in content. There are 24 students who are required to participate in the Montreal Regional High School Science Fair. 5 of them admitted to making up their research. So about 20% of all students who do science fair are making up their data. I didn't find this paper to be very compelling, but in the process of reading this paper and trying to see what science fair was about because it seemed interesting, I looked at the history of science fair, and that increased my interest substantially, and I'll explain why. So science fairs actually are an outgrowth of the thinking of John Dewey, the American philosopher. Over 100 years ago, Dewey presented this talk at the AAAS meeting about science as subject matter and as method. And actually, the subsequent talk about the scientific method arises from Dewey's paper and his other work. Only by taking a hand in the making of knowledge, by transferring a guess and opinion into belief, authorized by inquiry, does one ever get a knowledge of the method of knowing. So Dewey then was talking about practice, and somebody who took Dewey very seriously was this guy, Morris Meister, who later became really well known because he founded the famous Bronx School of Science. And if you read Meister's PhD thesis in Columbia, he talks a lot about Dewey, and Meister was interested in what were at that time called science play shops. And these kids were doing things equivalent in some ways of science fair. And he was the main sort of figure in the organization of the New York science clubs into a program that would do things together. And here's an article about the organizational meeting from the New York Times in 1932. And their goal is to aid in the development of the scientific leaders of the next generation, and at the same time foster a better understanding of science amongst its laymen. Science for everyone. And they proposed this confederation. And it's sort of amazing when you read this, because if you read current things from the National Academy, it says almost identical things. Well, but this was not the crucial moment here for me was seeing the name Morris Meister and wondering if Morris had any relationship to Alton Meister. And I learned that Morris had 4 children. Alton was one of them. Alton became a relatively well-known biochemist. And in 1966, Alton was the chair of biochemistry at Tufts New England Medical Center. I started my graduate school career in Alton Meister's laboratory. So this is where I began my work in biochemistry. And I figured that if it was good enough for me to start my work in biochemistry in Alton's laboratory, I should be doing something in science fair, since that's what his father started. So this very spooky coincidence is what really got me the help judge. And this is walking across here, Simon Daly, who was at the time the president of the science fair. So I approached Simon and said, could we maybe survey students at the Dallas Regional Fair and find out if they make up their data? And Simon organized me the opportunity to talk with his advisory group, and they were supportive of doing this survey. So that began a collaboration that now is going on for more than 7 years. So we were going to survey the students who are in the multi-regions that come to the Dallas Regional Science and Engineering Fair. But if you're trained as a biochemist, you always want to know what's the control group. And so I decided, well, I have a control group here at UT Southwestern Medical Center. And these are the post-high school students that are here as summer undergraduates and as PhD students and MD students. So I actually can now have 2 groups I can compare in these studies. One is the high school group. They just participated in science and engineering fairs. They're a regional group. They may not be interested in science and engineering careers. And I have a post-high school group that may or may not have participated in science fairs when they were in high schools. They're a state and national group, and they're interested in science and engineering careers. So these two groups we can compare to each other, and Simon and I were on our way. So the research model then becomes voluntary and anonymous surveys. This gives up the opportunity to interview people, but creates the opportunity to make the data public and not have to worry, and reduces all of the informed consent issues significantly. And we have the surveys embedded in the REDCap web application at UT Southwestern. So we asked students demographic information about their experience, including whether science fair was required. We asked them whether science fair should be optional or required, their perceived value. And we do this both quantitatively and qualitatively with open-end text questions. And we do this for both competitive versus non-competitive science fair, although we don't know if they know what non-competitive science fair is, and we're not sure we do either. And we asked them who helped. There are 9 possibilities, the kinds of help they received, 10 possibilities, the obstacles encountered, and how obstacles were overcome. And this generates a very large data set. And just to give you an idea of what it looks like, we look, and this is from some data from actually later in the talk, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to discuss it, but it just gives you an idea that you see that we have all of these answers from students. And if you look at graphs like these, you can right away see whether things look similar or different. If you're looking, comparing groups, and you can see which ones stand out. Whoops, what happened? So like the sources of help students receive, this is parents, this is teachers, this is internet articles. If you look at the types of help they receive, well, none of them really stand out a lot. This is developing the idea and fine-tuning the report. Obstacles faced, getting the idea, time, overcoming obstacles, more background research, perseverance. So this is the kind of data that we eventually will generate and we will analyze. So here's our initial result, our initial surveys. We send out the surveys to high school and post-high school students. As it turned out, only one of the schools in the North Texas region was willing to participate in our survey. And that was because the science coordinator of that school, a woman named Karen Shepard, was interested in the project. So she facilitated what we were doing and significantly, and actually became a collaborator in the work and helped design the surveys. So we sent out surveys to 112 high school students, 64 answered, 627 post-high school students. Turns out that, of course, 100% of the high school students have participated, a quarter of the post-high school students. 6% of the high school students had been required to participate, 40% of the post-high school students. None of them liked the requirement. They all thought it should be optional. They were more positive about non-competitive science fair. And so this is the kind of data that we generated. And if you look across here, you can see that basically high school students and post-high school students had the same experience. There are small differences, but in general, those tiny little those differences are, they may be, in this case, actually, none of them are statistically significant, but except for one, but they could be. In other cases, even if you see differences, they may be really sociologically irrelevant. But here's one big difference, and that was in coaching for the interview, where the high school students got a lot more help than the post-high school students. And regarding our original question about making up the data, here it is down here. None of the high school students and only one of the post-high school students made up their data. So we didn't confirm the Montreal study, but on the other hand, the Montreal students were required to do science fair and these students were not. So we'll come back to that. I'll come back to that. And then here's from that free text analysis, and the students, I was actually amazed. The students were very happy to write substantial things about their experiences in the context of whether or not we thought science fair should be required. And so these are the topics that they generated: scientific thinking skills, research skills, communication and presentation skills. These were positive. Not everyone is interested in science, no enjoyment, negative behaviors, no time. These were negatives. And this is what the data looks like. So for competitive science fair, almost nothing positive down here at scientific thinking skills and research skills versus if we looked at non-competitive science fair, much more positive on the part of the students. As you might expect, competition incentive was positive in the competition. And here was interesting. There are a bunch of students who commented about communication and presentation skills. And I'll actually come back later on. That becomes an important part of our later work. The most common thing that they didn't like was that, well, it just wasn't any fun. I didn't like science fair. And they didn't like to compete. And not everyone is interested in science. And finally, one thing that was really interesting and had a big impact again on our thinking was this comment especially by the post-high school students, that science fair is all about winning, not learning. And this was a really sophisticated comment, and it really introduced us in thinking about what it was we were accomplishing with science fair. So what we learned from the regional studies, only one student reported making up their data. The SEF experience was similar overall, except that the high school students weren't required to participate. This turns out not to be correct when you look at a national sample. The high percentage of the high school students received coaching compared to the post-high school students. This also turns out to be incorrect when you look at a national sample. Students don't like to be required to participate, but are more supportive for non-competitive science fairs, winning versus learning, and introduced me to the whole area of thinking about performance versus mastery skills, where winning and competitive science fair is about performing, learning, mastering the ideas about science is all about non-competitive science fair and learning. And then finally, 24%, a quarter of the post-high school students participated in science fair. How come, if they were interested in science, didn't they participate more? And I'm not going to talk more about the post-high school students, except to say that it turns out that only 40% of the post-high school students went to high schools where science fairs were available. And that seems to be a national finding, that 40 to 50% of high schools offer science fair competitions. So we published this work, myself, Simon, Karen Shepard, Joan Reich. Joan is the head of statistics at UT Southwestern, and she decided what we had to do statistically and how to present it. And that could have been it, over and out. But then we had an opportunity, unexpected opportunity. And that's because Scienteer registration and management went online. And so now we're going to see science fairs managed in a much broader way than just local regions. And Simon approached the Scienteer people, and they agreed that we could utilize our survey in their website. So now Scienteer is adopted by 7 states. They've been averaging recently about 40,000 students per year. If you calculate that, it says that there are 250,000 students doing science fair every year. And here's what they put into their website. Once your son or daughter has completed their science fair participation, they can be given a chance to participate in the survey created by scientists at UT Southwestern and SMU. And sort of the caveat here is that they have to have completed everything. And that's because we don't want them to think that participating in our survey will have any impact on the outcome of their survey of their science fair competition. So to date, we have 135,000 parental consents, and more than 3,000 students have completed surveys. And they have to actually go back into the website without a reminder after they're done everything in order to see the survey, which reduces, I think, the participation. So, and because we have now going national, we have a chance to ask questions that in an iterative fashion that are raised by the previous studies. And so it becomes a whole different kind of study now. So in 2016, we asked them, are you interested in a career in the sciences or engineering? And did your science fair experience increase your interests? And what we do is collect data for 2 years, so we can see if the results are reproducible for year to year. And then we analyze the new questions in the context of what we already knew. In 2018, we asked them, in which science fair competitions did you compete? And the ethnicity most identified with. In 2019, we asked them the location of their high school. This is a manuscript that's in preparation now. It's based on 2,400 students. And I'm going to tell you the results of this very briefly, but also then use this data set to show you the answers, a repetition of some of the major findings from the earlier publications, because now we have the opportunity to always go back and reanalyze the data. And then finally, we have new questions added in 2021, types of communication and presentation skills, and we added a reason why question answer opportunity to the question, did your science fair experience increase your interest in the sciences or engineering? And this data is in process, and fortunately for us, we'll get 2 years, but sadly, as of right now, anyway, the Scienteer site is scheduled to close at the end of this academic year. So that will end up with a large collection of data from students, but we won't be able to continue collecting going forward.
Fred, sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. Yeah, I noticed there is a question in the chat box. Would you mind answering that now? I can express the question here. So the question is, I wonder whether kids would produce the same responses about competitive versus non-competitive sports in high school. Why might competition be more accessible in sports? Is it because it is voluntary?
So actually, that's a really good question, and we've had students in their answers to the question, should it be required or optional? The reason why questions say to us, why should we have to participate in science fair if we're not interested? We don't have to participate in competitive store sports if we're not interested. That is exactly what the students argue as the reason why they shouldn't be required to compete. So that's it's not an unreasonable question, right? For the students to ask. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask them as we go. I want to give a talk about ethical issues in genetics to a public group. And at the end of the talk, somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, "Could you please explain again what's a gene?" And I was sort of like crushed because I realized that a lot of people didn't have a clue what I was talking about. And so I'm always happy to have questions as I go, just to make sure that people understand what I'm saying. Okay.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So this is the latest data set. And so what we really like to do is compare year to year initially, just to, this is our notion of reproducibility, to see if we get the same answers. We were really a little bit curious here what would happen because COVID was 2021. And as it turned out, both at the level of Scienteer and at the level of our surveys, there was about a 50% reduction in the participation in science fair, but we didn't see any change in the pattern, not in the grade levels, not in whether science fair was required. By the way, science fair is required now. We've learned when we do our national studies, about 60% of students. So unlike that group back in the Dallas regional group, which was 6%, nationally, most students who do science fair are required to do it. Mostly they do it in 9th and 10th grade, and mostly they do it in suburban schools. And I don't know whether it's mostly females are more likely to answer our questions or that females are more likely to do science fair, but it's usually about 40-60. And there is some literature that I've seen, including maybe from the Harvard Education Group, that females are more likely to do science fairs than males, but I don't remember that exactly. And here, ethnicity, Asian students and white students are the most doing science fair, Hispanic less, and Black the least, and then other. You can take these numbers here and compare them with high school students. Here's the 2021 high school student population. Asian students were 5%. They were doing roughly 35% of the science fair. People doing science fair, kids doing science fair were Asian. Now, this is not just an aberration of our surveys, because these numbers, while they're a little bit different from the Scienteer registration, Scienteer itself records ethnicity, and if you take in consideration the slightly different value for other that Scienteer gets, which I'm not going to talk about today, these numbers show the same pattern as the Scienteer numbers, which is that Asian students are way overrepresented in science fair. Black, Hispanic, and white students are underrepresented. So what are the key findings from the surveys? And I'm gonna, the first one is the unpublished one. Students from suburban and urban schools have the same outcomes. So here's the gray bar are the suburban schools, black bar is the urban schools. Science fair is required. Parents, teachers, scientists, internet, books, and magazines, the degree of help. If you look at competition level, school is school only, and then they can go beyond to district or region or state. Increased interest, science and education career, almost identical results for whether you did science fair and said you were from a suburban school or from an urban school. Although about 3/4 of the kids were from suburban schools. And this is really important, because if science fair was only for the kids who were going to suburban schools, which a lot of times people think of are more affluent than urban schools, then it really couldn't be science fair, couldn't not be science for everyone. But it's really encouraging. Now there are statistical differences here. Like for instance, the question, is science fair required? The p-value, there is a difference here of 0.07 and a chi-square analysis. But like, as is the case of most of these, this may be statistically significant, but we're not convinced it's sociologically relevant. It's sort of, it's there, but it's not a really large impact. Now maybe all of these things add up. In general, the suburban schools are slightly where there's something that could be better. The suburban schools are slightly advantaged, but especially like in science fair increased your interest in science and engineering. Even this difference is not statistically significant. There is a difference though in where the kids go to school, and so this is for all the students. It's about 3/4 suburban. Only the Hispanic students have almost equivalent urban presence in science fair, as well as suburban. And if you try to compare this with national data, it's a little bit tricky actually, because people in science education use urban, suburban, and rural, and the national statistics from the Department of Education are more nuanced into city, suburban, town, and rural. But what is clear is that 20% of the students who are rural, according to national standards, don't appear in our science fair studies. So 84 students out of 2,500 roughly are from rural schools. And especially you see this with white students, where 28% of white students are, according to, are from rural communities, and only 3.9% in science fair. So this is a big question. Where are the students from rural schools? Are they not using Scienteer because they stay locally in their school or district and don't go beyond? Or do they not participate because science fairs often require going, at least when you get to the higher levels, like regional fairs, travel, and maybe they can't afford it. So we don't know the answer to this question. But although we can say that I think that urban and suburban students are equally competitive in science fairs, we are missing the rural students, of whom there are a lot. And we don't know where that fits in. And that's, I think, an important research question. Okay, 75% of students who do SEFs do so in 9th and 10th grade, and that's a different experience. So here's 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. If you're looking at the extent of participation, it's obvious that it falls off. Here's they're interested in science and engineering career. The 9th and 10th graders are less interested in the 11th and 12th graders, and the ones who are not sure go off. And one of the findings from the Harvard Science Education Group studies of science fair, I think, as I understand it, is that science fairs play more of a role in helping maintain student interest than in getting new students interested in science. And I think this data completely agrees with that way of thinking. It is interest, there is increased interest at the higher grades potentially. Certainly the kids at the higher grades are more likely to get to regional state competitions. That parents are helping the kids at the higher grades and parental help falls off dramatically, whereas help from teachers and scientists increases. And the likelihood of a SEF requirement falls off as you go from 9th and 10th to 11th and 12th. So one of the points that Simon and I have been making is that there really are two science fairs. And we think that we should be thinking about actually organizing them with different purposes. So for instance, maybe 9th and 10th grade science fair should all be about mastery, whereas 11th and 12th about performance. Maybe it's more important that there be non-competitive options in 9th and 10th grade, for instance. So anyway, that's one of the first things that we think that we've learned. Another is about what things contribute to whether students have a positive or negative consequence experience in science fair. And being required is negative. Getting help from scientists is positive. And getting help coaching for the interview is positive. And I mean, these are really major changes, and I'm going to show you that data now. So this is if you're not required versus required to do science fair. So not required, required, increased interest. Science and engineering career, not required, required. Competition level, regional and state, not required, required. Help, okay? Parents and teachers are almost identical, but for scientists, not required, required. And making up the data. Well, so this is back to the original Montreal study. And now we see that the difference is not gigantic, but 3% of the kids who are required made up their data versus 1.3% of the kids who are not required. So that's not a big deal, but at least it emphasizes that when you tell somebody that they have to do something and they really don't want to do it, that they might respond with inappropriate behavior. So this is not required versus required. This is help from scientists. Okay, so if you got help from scientists or no help. Increased your interest, science and engineering career. If you're in competition level, if you don't get help from scientists, you're likely to stay at a school level. If you get help from scientists, you're going to go beyond. And help from scientists doesn't really have much impact on parents or teachers, but you're more likely to use the internet or to use books and magazines. And now, one of the things about this is that the other thing, this does not include coaching for the interview. So we had enough data here so we could actually analyze the effect of help from scientists without being concerned about coaching for the interview, because that has its own positive effects. And here's coaching for the interview. And this without, with help from scientists removed. So here we have increased interest, science and engineering career, competition level, sources of help. Well, here parents and teachers are more important because obviously they're the ones who are doing the coaching. So we have these three major contributors to what appears to be students having a better science fair experience. And so, but just to show you the comparison between all of the students, the 2,800 students from 2017, 2018, the comparison with those high school students I told you about at the beginning. Science fair, so the high school students, the national cohort, 63% required, 7% get help from scientists, 16% get coaching for the interview. Amongst the 64 students back in the regional cohort from the Plano Independent School District, which is one of the most successful in Texas, 6% are required, 26% get help from scientists, 60% get coaching for the interview. Another one of the things I think that Simon and I think and have recommended is that these are ways of making science fair experience actually much more effective than it is now, and maybe are ways that the consequences of incorporating would be to increase student interest in science. Yes.
Hi, Fred. Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. Actually,
Yeah.
I have two questions here.
Yes.
So my first question is, I noticed that in a few pages back, there is the help from the intellect, but
Yes.
there is one PowerPoint that didn't show the help from the intellect. It's just like a 3 pages backward. So it's this one. So here the SEF help, I didn't see why there is no help from the intellect.
So I think probably because the things that I included remember, it's like there are 100 different elements. So the things I included were the ones where there was the biggest change. So with the science fair requirement, there was not a big change for the group required or not required in help in using the internet.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, my second question is, you just mentioned the coaching for the interview is effective to our the result. So would you mind sharing a little bit more? What kind of coaching here? Why it is more effective? Yes.
Okay, so this is the disadvantage of not interviewing students directly and being able to do follow-up questions is that we can't ask that question. We know that they talk about getting coached for the interview, and they say they've received coaching, but what they mean by receiving coaching, we can't be exactly sure of. Just like when they say they're required to do science fair, we don't know exactly what that means. Or when they say they got help from the scientists, we don't know exactly what that means. It's their perception that they got coaching, or that they were required, or they got help.
Okay.
And so one of this new question that we asked, or we added, asking them the reason why, if they say science fair did or did not increase their interest in science and engineering, one of the reasons why adding that reason why question that we incorporated beginning last year was that we hope that maybe some of them will address that in answering that question. All right, so the finally group is that has to do with gender and ethnicity. And again, as consistent with studies that were reported, I think originally from the Massachusetts State Science Fair by the Harvard Education Group, we don't see any differences in male or female participation or level of success. They get help from scientists and parents and teachers to the same extent, pretty much. Maybe a little different here with the scientists, but overall similar. The SEF level they participate in is similar. Their level of that they say of increased interest from science and engineering fair participation is similar. And what they say about science and engineering careers is overall similar, slight differences, where it looks a little bit like males are slightly more interested, and so that, and there may be slightly more help from scientists, but again, you know, the differences are statistically significant, but whether or not how important they are remains to be known. And then here's the ethnicity data, where we see that if you look at competition levels, the Black and white students are most likely to be competing only at the school level. Hispanic students do the best at the district level, maybe because the district science fairs tend to be more urban, and there were more, as I mentioned before, there was more Hispanic students competing in urban environments. The regional science fair, here's Asian and Hispanic. But consistently, the Black students and the white students, especially, don't do as well. At the state fair, again, you can just sort of see the little blips here. Increased interest. So the Asian students and the Hispanic students are the most positive about the impact of science fairs on their interest. About SES&E career, the Asian students are definitely, more likely to say they're interested. The others are similar, maybe a little bit more Hispanic students. Help from parents, all the same except the white students. The white students get more help from parents, but it doesn't seem to help in these other things. Coaching for the interview, or help from scientists. Here are the Black students, they get less coaching than anybody else, less help from scientists than anybody else. And coaching for the interview, they get less coaching. And the Black students and Hispanic and white students are the most likely to be required. So the experiences for all students could be obviously increased, but the Black students and to a lesser extent the white students are not doing nearly as well in science fairs as Asian and Hispanic students. If you had told me that beforehand, I would have never predicted that. My sort of prejudices would be that Black and Hispanic students had a not as good experience as Asian and white students, but that just turns out to be a prejudice that is wrong. And it was actually really good to see that science and engineering fairs had such a positive impact on Hispanic students, and also was further evidence, since they're the ones who were the most of all the groups to participate in urban environments, urban schools, that suburban and urban schools can function similarly. So that's the end of the data I want to present from the past, but just to be clear about what Simon and I hope to do, and that's we want to change science fairs. We want to make them more effective. And so we haven't only been publishing data sets, but also publishing a series of essays, opinion essays, most recently in Connected Science Learning, to sort of describe our results. And the other thing is that all our survey results are published open access. So there's an incredible amount of data that we are accumulating that we think other people might take advantage of in separate analyses, because this is, I think, a unique data set. So tell me where we are time-wise. What time do?
We're in good shape, Fred. You have time for questions, or if you want to go for another couple minutes and briefly talk about the future studies, we can do that as well.
All right, so let me just tell you very quickly about future studies. One is that I was presenting this talk at UT Dallas, and Lydia Allen, who's a graduate student there, but also the head of the Writing Center at Southern Methodist University, said, you know what, communication and presentation skills could be thought of as an independent outcome of science fair. And so we said, maybe so. And so we incorporated a question on the types of communication and presentation skills that students used in their projects. And we're going to analyze that we incorporated that question last year. But equally important, her comments got us to start thinking more about SEF experiences of undergraduates across the curriculum. So and we did a pilot study at SMU, and we've got 32 students out of 194 who said they participated in science fair. and 63% of those were required. So completely consistent with the other findings. But the thing is that since they're required, that means they're often not going to be interested in science and engineering, which is exactly the case. So the STEM interests at SMU of these students who filled out these surveys was STEM, business, humanities. We didn't have enough students to be more nuanced. And here are the students who participated in science fair, which is, again, very similar to the overview. So there's students who are in business and science and humanities are being required to participate in science fair, even though they may not want to be there. And so we asked them if their science fair had what sort of effect or science fair had on their communication and presentation skills. And 77% of the students in STEM, 50% in business, and one of the humanities students said that science fair helped them. And then here are things that they wrote. And just I'll mention the business student helped me articulate myself in a subject I had been focusing on for weeks, or the humanities student being forced to not only defend your result, but also your process. So we really think that this is a worthwhile thing to study in much more detail now. And we've established 3 university collaborations. After hearing about the science education program at Harvard, maybe we could establish a 4th. We want to survey, we have 7,000 undergraduates at SMU. So we're going to work with Lydia Allen and with Rick Duschel, who's the head of the Kruth Institute of Engineering there. And UT Arlington has 32,000 undergraduates, and Corey Forbes is collaborating with us. He's the head of the UTA Education, Research Collaboration and Resource Center and University of Texas at Dallas. So we want to, find out what students did in terms of science fair and whether or not the science and communication and presentation skills were valuable to them. And then finally, we want to find out about teachers. We know nothing about teachers and whether they agree with students. So we're going to do teacher surveys. Scienteer has already built our survey into their website. Unfortunately, it's just going to be this year. UT Southwestern has a STARS program, outreach program. And so we're going to reach out to theirs. And if I can raise the funding, because NSTA wants $3,000 per email, I'm going to, the NSTA has agreed to send our survey to their 27,000 teachers. And we're going to find out what teachers think generally and what sort of support they receive, and maybe getting some insights into why so many schools do not offer science fairs and how their ideas overlap with their students. So that's all I have to say. And let me stop sharing, and then see if I can answer any questions.
Thank you, Fred. This is really enlightening and fascinating information. And I can talk with you offline about working with NSTA. I'm the division director for research in science and education on the board. So I'll talk with you offline on that one and getting that information out. But we do have just a couple minutes left. If anybody else has questions, comments, feel free to just unmute and ask away.
Yeah, this is Phil Sadler. I have a comment question. So I think this is a beautiful set of studies. This is great data about what is happening out there in science fairs, which is, very useful and illustrative for people. My question, or my focus, is usually how to figure out what are best practices, what aspects, in this case, what aspects of science fairs increase or maintain student interest in STEM. So their choices, one of them is certainly whether it's mandatory or not, there are choices that teachers or schools can make, or people who organize the science fairs, they can make that might up the chances of, for instance, somebody's increased interest in going into science. Have you thought about the kinds of study, how you might figure that out? And do you have any hypotheses beyond the mandatory nature of science fairs, of some science fairs, about what actually is a best practice?
Well, thank you for what is obviously the most important question. And that is, you know, how you transition our studies into practices. And really, that's something that we don't have the capacity directly to do because of the nature of who we are. And but one would like, for instance, you know, to encourage schools in an experimental way, maybe to offer a non-competitive option as well as a competitive option, or at least regional science fairs or district science fairs, and see who participates, how that works out. That could, you know, be a very positive thing. One of the things that we've learned is that coaching for the interview can have an extraordinarily positive, appears to have an extraordinarily positive impact, and it doesn't have to be done by scientists. You can take them out of the equation. Well, if teachers know that coaching for the interview was so important. See, the problem, in part from what I get talking to teachers, is they don't have time. And that's one of the reasons why we want to, you know, do these teacher surveys to find out, you know, what they perceive as barriers, because even if you know what will help, they don't have time to do it because they're too busy teaching to the standards. You know, that then you have to figure out other options. Another thing is that you have programs like our program at UT Southwestern. That is a science outreach program to the high schools, but it could more specifically make itself available to help students with their science fair projects. And especially now that we have the capacity to, you know, interact by long distance, like we're doing right now. I think there are a lot of options for innovations that can be tried out. But you sort of have to begin knowing what innovations might be the ones that would have the biggest impact. And personally, I think getting help from scientists and coaching for the interviews from our studies are the two that seem to be the ones that stand out. There's a lot of other richness in this data as well that we don't have have not yet analyzed, and may not even have the statistical ability to analyze, which is one of the reasons why we're making it available to everybody else. Mm-hmm. But I think that's maybe not an effective, but my best effort at trying to answer your question. So.
Any other questions before we wrap up?
I have one.
Go ahead, Mary.
So I think one of your slides suggested that one of the biggest barriers or challenges or difficulties was around choosing a topic or selecting right. And I'm wondering about, with regard to Phil's question of practices, you know, scaffolds for identifying doable projects, or where do those exist and how do teachers have access to them? I'm just thinking in our own little practice world of microobservatory, for example, it's a tool with which you can do really interesting investigations free with powerful research equipment, but I don't think we have any scaffolds now, as I think about it, specifically for science fair participants and things that they might do.
Right. I guess there are, websites like Science Buddies and others that come up with long lists of possible science fair projects. So it's interesting in the that in the study of bioscience undergraduates, which I didn't talk about today, and we asked. One of the things that we asked them is if they could have done science fair and they didn't do it, what were the main reasons why not? And the two reasons that stuck out were one, time, and the other is not a good idea for project. So even students who are in high school who already are interested enough in science so that, or presumably because they go on to become graduate students in the undergraduate science majors, even they have trouble figuring out what they want to study. And so I think that, developing some kind of scaffold or other kind of, yeah. So one of the things that I told Cynthia this sort of offline, and that is that I have for the last couple of years periodically sent emails to the Academy, to the science education program, and told them that I thought they really should have a workshop on science fairs and bring together all of the folks who are interested in science fairs to discuss best practices and how to move forward. And I have met with no positive responses from them. You had Heidi here last year talking to you, and she's the person who I complained to the most. And actually, if you think about how many people do science fair, it's extraordinary to me that you can look in the National Academy publications and find zero mention of science fairs. And so, when they're talking about informal science education, and the science fairs start out in schools, but then ultimately moved into the community. And it's the community that organizes the regional fairs and has to get together all the judges. The community could play, has a lot of opportunities for, interacting with the high school students, like, for instance, through our STARS program, like I mentioned. So I think there's an awful lot that could be done that just hasn't been explored. And I don't know what the reluctance is, but that's just the way it is, right? Maybe one of you know why Academy doesn't want to deal with science fairs.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
No.
I'm a good buddy of Fred Grinnell's, and one of the things I was just wondering about is whose responsibility at the national level it might be to improve or to help nurture science fairs. And do any of the national organizations like the American Society of Cell Biology or FASEB or any of those have any initiatives going, or do they offer any support to science fairs nationally?
Well, there are major, Bill, science national initiatives in science education, like Howard Hughes Medical Institute has the Science Education Alliance. And so, but I don't know of any organization that specifically focuses on science fairs, except for the international, the group that sponsors the International Science Fair, and it's what is this, public science? I forget the name of the organization, but they run the science fairs, and so they play a major role as sponsors, but they establish rules and methods for judging, but they don't really do a lot about developing best practices for how schools should get kids involved in science fairs.
Interesting. All right. Well, we are at past 11:30, but I know we could continue this rich conversation for quite a while, but I know people have other meetings to attend, et cetera. So I want to conclude by thanking Fred Grinnell for a fascinating talk. Thank you so much for all the information and data on science fairs. And I think this is not the last we'll hear of this. Frank did put something in the chat for those of you who are interested. Apparently there's an indie documentary from National Geographic on looking at science fairs and raising awareness for inclusion and equity, as well as maybe implementation strategies. So that link is in the chat if anybody's interested. So once again, I want to thank Fred Grinnell for his presentation on science fairs for everyone. And I hope you all found it interesting and something to pursue and to continue thinking about. So we will make the talk available on our YouTube channel. And Fred has also given us a copy of his PowerPoint presentation. So Fred, I'll just double check with you. If anybody is interested in those slides, we can share that with them, correct?
Sure.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, Fred, and we'll see everybody at the next seminar.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.